The stillness of stone. There is a particular quality to stone that reveals itself only in the deepest hours of night. Not the warmth it holds from afternoon sun, nor the rough texture your fingers trace in daylight, but something else entirely. A stillness that seems to breathe with the weight of centuries. Tonight, as you've finally set aside the endless stream of messages and notifications, as you've closed the laptop on another day that demanded more than it gave, I want to take you to a place where stone walls held a different kind of sleepless mind. A place where the weight of an empire pressed down upon one man's shoulders, much as the weight you carry presses upon yours. The year is 524. The city of Pavia sleeps fitfully under a blanket of stars, but in a cell beneath the palace, a man sits wakeful against cold stone. His name is Anicius Manlius Severinus Boethius. Though tonight, stripped of his titles and his certainties, he might simply call himself a prisoner of his own thoughts. The stone wall against his back carries the chill of autumn deep into his bones. Not the sharp cold that makes you shiver and move, but the slow, persistent cold that settles into your very core. The kind that reminds you, with each breath, exactly where you are. He pulls his rough woolen tunic closer, this man who once wore silk in the halls of power. The fabric scratches against skin that knew softer things, silk and comfort, and the gentle weight of respect. But tonight, there is only this coarse wool, this stone, this darkness that seems to press in from all sides. Through the narrow window, high above his reach, comes the faintest suggestion of the city beyond. A dog barking in some distant street, the creak of a cartwheel on cobblestone, the murmur of voices from a tavern where men drink wine and speak freely, as he once did. Do you know that feeling? When the world continues its rhythm while yours has stopped entirely? When you lie in your own darkness, listening to life carry on without you, wondering how everything can seem so normal when nothing at all, feels normal anymore? 6 months ago, Boethius was the most trusted advisor to King Theodoric, the bridge between the Roman Senate and the Gothic court, the man who could translate not just languages, but entire ways of thinking, Greek philosophy into Latin wisdom, ancient truths into modern governance. He had been building something magnificent, a great work of translation that would preserve the wisdom of Aristotle and Plato for generations yet unborn. In his private study, surrounded by scrolls and codices, he would work deep into the night, not from anxiety, but from pure intellectual joy. The thrill of finding exactly the right Latin word to capture a Greek concept. The satisfaction of building bridges across centuries. But building something meaningful. You know this yourself. Building something that matters makes you vulnerable in ways that smaller ambitions never could. The accusation, when it came, was swift and brutal. Treason, conspiracy against the crown, magic and sorcery. As if his learning itself was somehow suspect. As if the very act of thinking deeply, of questioning, of seeking truth beyond the surface of things, as if this was dangerous. Perhaps it was. He shifts against the stone, trying to find a position that doesn't remind his body of its confinement. But there is no such position. The cell is perhaps 8 feet square, 3 steps in any direction before you meet a wall. He has counted them. In daylight, in darkness, in the strange gray hours between, he has counted them until the numbers themselves became a kind of prison. This is what they don't tell you about losing everything you've built. It's not the grand moment of collapse that breaks you. It's the small, relentless reminders. The way your body expects comfort that no longer comes? The way your mind reaches for routines that no longer exist? The way hope itself becomes a weight you're not sure you can carry? In his former life, Boethius would rise before dawn and walk through his gardens, thinking through the problems of the day. Not the urgent crises that demanded immediate response, but the deeper questions. How should a just society balance mercy with justice? What does it mean to live well when the world around you seems to be losing its way? How do you hold on to truth when power itself seems built on shifting sand? These were the questions that energized him, that made the long hours of translation and correspondence feel like a calling rather than mere work. He was building something larger than himself, a bridge between the wisdom of the past and the needs of the present. But tonight, those same questions feel different, heavier, when you've lost your position, your freedom, your future. When you sit in darkness wondering if tomorrow will bring execution or merely another day of this slow dissolution. What does philosophy matter then? The stone beneath him has worn smooth from countless other bodies, other prisoners, other sleepless nights, other minds grappling with the sudden collapse of everything they thought they knew. He runs his fingers along the surface and wonders about their stories. Did they also lie awake calculating what went wrong? Did they also replay conversations, searching for the moment when trust became suspicion, when service became betrayal? You know this particular torment, don't you? The way a sleepless mind becomes an archaeologist of failure, digging through the layers of recent history, searching for the crack where everything began to crumble. Was it the letter you wrote defending Senator Albinus? Was it the translation that preserved ideas some considered too dangerous? Was it simply the crime of thinking that truth mattered more than convenience? Or perhaps it was none of these things. Perhaps it was simply the way power works, the way it must always find enemies to justify its own existence, the way it fears most those who serve it best, because they see too clearly how fragile the whole structure really is. The irony is not lost on him. For years, he had worked to strengthen the very system that now crushes him. He had believed that wisdom could guide power, that philosophy could make governance more just, more thoughtful, more humane. He had believed that what he was building mattered, that the careful work of translation and interpretation and bridge building between cultures could actually change the world. From somewhere in the palace above comes the faint sound of laughter. A feast, perhaps, or simply the easy conversation of those whose position remains secure. The sound drifts down through stone and timber to reach him here in his darkness, and for a moment he feels the full weight of isolation. This is the loneliness that comes not from being alone, but from being forgotten, from realizing that the world you helped to build continues quite well without you, that the meetings happen, the decisions are made, the empire continues its slow turn toward whatever future awaits, and your absence is barely noted. But then something shifts in the quality of his attention. Perhaps it's the exhaustion finally overtaking the endless cycling of regret and analysis. Perhaps it's simply that the human mind can only sustain panic for so long before it begins to seek something else, something steadier. He finds himself noticing the stone again, but differently now. Not as the wall of his confinement, but as something that has endured. This stone was cut from quarries when Rome was young. It was shaped by hands that knew their craft, fitted into place by builders who cared about their work. It has held the weight of this structure through decades of political upheaval, through the rise and fall of emperors, through wars and peace and the slow, grinding changes that reshape civilizations. The stone doesn't care about his disgrace. It doesn't mourn his lost position or celebrate his downfall. It simply endures, holding its place in the larger structure, doing what stone does, providing foundation, providing stability, providing the solid ground upon which other things can be built. And in that recognition, something begins to settle in Boethius's restless mind. Not peace, exactly. Not yet. But a kind of recognition. A remembering of something he once knew but had forgotten in the urgency of his fear. There is a quality to truth that resembles stone. It endures beyond the rise and fall of those who serve it or betray it. The philosophical insights he spent years translating, they existed before him and will exist after him. The questions he grappled with in his study, they were asked by minds centuries before his birth and will be asked by minds centuries after his death. What he was building, perhaps it was never really his to begin with. The thought should be humbling, even devastating. But instead, as he sits in darkness with his back against ancient stone, it begins to feel like the first solid thing he has touched in months. The first truth that doesn't shift under the weight of his circumstances. He is not the builder. He is not even the building. He is simply, for this brief moment in the long arc of human questioning, the hands that held the tools, and the work itself, the real work, continues in ways he cannot see, and through means he cannot control. The night is deepest now. Even the distant sounds of the city have faded into the profound quiet that comes only in the hours before dawn. In this stillness, Boethius finds his breathing beginning to slow, his shoulders beginning to release their grip on tension that serves no purpose. Tomorrow may bring his execution, or it may bring another day of waiting, another night of stone and darkness, and the slow work of understanding what it means to lose everything you thought defined you. But tonight he sits with the stone, learning its patience, beginning to remember that some things endure not because they fight, but because they know how to hold steady in the face of forces larger than themselves. And in that steadiness, something new begins to stir. A glimmer of hope, a seed of doubt. Something new begins to stir, and with it comes the faintest suggestion of light. Not the harsh glare of interrogation torches or the flickering uncertainty of oil lamps, but something softer. Dawn, perhaps. Though in this windowless cell, dawn is more felt than seen. A subtle shift in the quality of darkness, a barely perceptible warming of the stone beneath his hand. You know this feeling, don't you? Those moments when you've been awake since 3 in the morning, wrestling with problems that seemed insurmountable in the darkness, and then something changes. Not the problems themselves, perhaps, but your relationship to them. The weight you carry doesn't disappear, but somehow it settles differently across your shoulders. Boethius lifts his head from where it has been resting against the wall. His neck protests, stiff from hours in the same position. But there's something else now. A clarity he hadn't expected. The frantic circling of his thoughts has slowed, like a spinning coin finally coming to rest. And in that stillness, questions begin to form. Not the desperate, clawing questions of the night. Why me? How could this happen? What did I do wrong? But deeper ones, quieter ones, the kind that don't demand immediate answers, but instead invite contemplation. What is justice? The question surfaces in his mind like a stone emerging from receding water. He has spent his life in service to justice, or what he believed justice to be. Fair governance, honest counsel, protection of the innocent. These weren't abstract concepts to him. They were the foundation of what he was building, the very purpose that gave shape to his days. But now he sits accused of treason by the very system he served, condemned by the very principles he thought he understood. Was he wrong about justice? Or is justice something more complex, more elusive than he had imagined? You've faced this moment too, haven't you? When the rules you thought governed success, fairness, the way things should work, when those rules suddenly seem arbitrary, even cruel. When playing by the book gets you nowhere, and cutting corners seems to be rewarded. When your integrity feels less like a strength and more like a liability. Boethius closes his eyes and lets his mind drift back through the years of study, the countless hours spent with scrolls and texts, seeking wisdom in the words of those who came before. Plato's vision of perfect forms, existing beyond the messy imperfection of the physical world. Aristotle's careful cataloging of virtues, his belief that excellence was a habit, not an accident. How young he had been then, how certain. How convinced that wisdom was something you could accumulate like grain in a storehouse, something you could possess and deploy when needed. He remembers the weight of those early books in his hands, the smell of parchment and ink, the satisfaction of a difficult passage finally understood. The way knowledge seemed to build upon itself, each insight adding to a growing foundation of certainty about how the world worked. The good will be rewarded. The wicked will be punished. Truth will prevail. Such beautiful, simple formulas. Such comfort in their clarity. But life has proven more complicated than any formula. The weight you carry knows this too. You've seen good people fail, watched as their honesty was exploited, their kindness taken for weakness. You've seen others succeed through methods you couldn't stomach, building their empires on foundations you wouldn't trust to hold your own weight. And yet, here you are, still building, still carrying that weight, still believing somehow that what you're doing matters. Why? Boethius shifts against the stone wall, feeling the rough texture through his torn clothing. His body aches, but his mind feels clearer than it has in hours. The question doesn't torment him now. It intrigues him. Why do we continue when the rules seem broken? Why do we hold to principles when they seem to offer no protection? Perhaps he has been thinking about this wrong. Perhaps justice isn't a contract, a simple exchange where good deeds guarantee good outcomes. Perhaps it's something else entirely. The thought comes to him slowly, like dawn itself, gradual, almost imperceptible at first, then growing stronger. What if justice isn't about getting what you deserve? What if it's about becoming who you're meant to be? He thinks of the stone around him, patient and enduring. The stone doesn't expect reward for its steadiness. It doesn't demand recognition for holding up the walls, for providing foundation and shelter. It simply is solid, reliable, true to its nature regardless of circumstance. Is that what wisdom looks like? He wonders. Not the accumulation of knowledge, but the cultivation of character. Not the guarantee of reward, but the integrity to remain true to your principles, even when, especially when, no one is watching, no one is keeping score. The idea should feel cold, perhaps even hopeless. After all, what comfort is there in virtue that goes unrewarded, in integrity that leads to a prison cell? But strangely, surprisingly, it doesn't feel hopeless at all. It feels liberating. You understand this, don't you? That moment when you stop trying to control outcomes and start focusing on inputs, when you stop asking, "What will this get me?" and start asking, "Who does this make me?" The weight you carry shifts when you realize that some things are worth doing simply because they're worth doing. Not because they guarantee success, but because they align with something deeper than success. Boethius feels something stirring in the darkness of his cell. Not hope, exactly. Not yet. But possibility. The faintest suggestion that his current circumstances, devastating as they are, might not be the end of his story, but rather a chapter. Perhaps even a necessary chapter. What if this isn't happening to me? He wonders. What if it's happening for me? The question surprises him with its audacity. How can imprisonment, disgrace, the loss of everything he has built, how can any of that be for him? And yet, sitting here in the darkness, stripped of position and power and all the external markers of success, he feels more himself than he has in years. The constant noise of political maneuvering, the endless calculations of advantage and strategy, the weight of others' expectations, all of it has fallen away, leaving something simpler, more essential. Just him. Just the questions that matter. Just the slow, patient work of understanding. Perhaps this is what his years of study were preparing him for. Not the ability to quote philosophers at dinner parties or impress colleagues with clever arguments, but this, the capacity to sit with uncertainty, to find meaning in suffering, to discover strength in apparent weakness. He remembers something now, a passage from his early reading. The mind that is at peace gives life to the body. At the time, he had filed it away as an interesting observation about the connection between mental and physical health. But now he begins to sense its deeper meaning. Peace isn't the absence of trouble. Peace is the presence of something stronger than trouble, something that can coexist with uncertainty, with loss, even with fear, and remain unshaken. What would that look like, he wonders? What would it mean to find that kind of peace? The stone beneath his hand seems to pulse with quiet warmth, as if responding to his question. Or perhaps something else is stirring in the darkness of his cell. A presence he hadn't noticed before, or hadn't been ready to notice. Wisdom. Not the kind he had pursued in his books and studies, but something older, deeper, more patient. Wisdom that doesn't come from accumulating knowledge, but from releasing the need to know everything. Wisdom that finds strength in surrender, victory in apparent defeat. For just a moment, he could swear he hears something. A voice, perhaps, though whether it comes from within or without, he cannot say. Gentle, knowing, tinged with something that might almost be amusement. "You have been looking for me in all the wrong places," the voice seems to whisper. "I was never in your books, or your position, or your reputation. I was always here, waiting for you to stop running long enough to listen." Boethius holds his breath, afraid that any movement might shatter this fragile moment. The voice, if it is a voice, feels familiar somehow. Like coming home after a long journey to find that home was exactly where you left it. Exactly where it had always been. "Who are you?" he whispers into the darkness, but even as he asks, he begins to suspect the answer. And with that suspicion comes the first real stirring of something he had almost forgotten how to feel. Hope. The ink of reason. The first light of dawn finds Boethius reaching for something he hasn't touched in months. Not his legal briefs or his administrative documents, but a simple quill and a piece of parchment. His hands shake slightly, As he dips the nib into the small pot of ink they've allowed him, the weight of the quill feels different now. Not like the instrument of power it once was when he signed decrees and drafted letters to senators. This feels lighter, somehow. More honest. He pauses, the ink trembling at the tip of the quill, and thinks of you there in your own quiet moment. How many times have you sat before a blank page or empty screen, trying to capture something true about what you're building? Trying to make sense of the weight you carry? Carmina qui quondam studio florente peregi. The Latin flows from his pen almost without conscious thought. Songs I once composed with flourishing zeal. But even as he writes these opening words of what will become his great work, he stops. The irony isn't lost on him. Here he is, writing about songs and poetry, when what he really needs to understand is why everything fell apart. He sets down the quill for a moment and looks at his hands. These same hands that once held the seals of office, that signed documents affecting thousands of lives, that built what he thought was an unshakable foundation of justice in a crumbling world. You know those hands, don't you? The ones that have typed countless emails, signed contracts that kept you awake at night, shaken on deals that would determine whether your vision lived or died. The hands that carry the invisible weight of every decision. Boethius picks up the quill again. This time, instead of verse, he begins to write more directly, more personally. I who once wrote songs am now compelled to take up weeping measures. I who once flourished am now withered. My work lies in ruins. My reputation destroyed. Everything I built, gone. The scratch of the quill against parchment becomes almost rhythmic, meditative. There's something about the physical act of writing that his mind seems to crave. Not the frantic scribbling of notes in meetings or the hurried signatures on endless documents. This is different, slower, more intentional. The ink spreads slightly where he pauses too long, creating small, dark pools that remind him of the uncertainty that now colors everything. But instead of frustration, he feels something unexpected, a kind of relief. But what is this thing I thought I had built? He writes, what is this success I believed I had achieved? The question hangs in the air of his cell like incense. You've asked yourself this same question, haven't you? In those moments when the metrics don't tell the whole story, when the external markers of progress feel somehow hollow against the deeper purpose that drove you to begin. He dips the quill again, and the smell of the ink rises to meet him. Iron and oak gall, mixed with something faintly sweet. It's a smell that takes him back to his youth, to the library where he first discovered philosophy, where he first believed that wisdom and justice could reshape the world. I accumulated wealth, he continues writing, but what is wealth? I gained influence, but what is influence? I built a reputation, but what is reputation when it can be destroyed by a single accusation? The words come faster now, as if they've been waiting inside him for months, pressed down by the weight of his circumstances, and only now finding their way to the surface. The things I thought were mine were never mine at all. They were borrowed, on loan, like costumes in a play that must be returned when the performance ends. He pauses here, struck by his own metaphor. Yes, that's exactly what it feels like, as if he's been playing a role. The successful senator, the powerful administrator, the man who had it all figured out. And now the play has ended. The costume has been taken away, and he's left wondering who he actually is underneath. The morning light grows stronger, casting longer shadows across his small table. He can hear the guards changing shifts in the corridor outside. Life continuing its rhythm while he sits here, trying to understand what rhythm actually means. But if these things were never truly mine, then losing them, what have I actually lost? The question surprises him even as he writes it. He sets down the quill and reads the words again. What has he actually lost? His position? That was always subject to the whims of politics. His wealth? Most of it came from family inheritance and political favor, things he never created himself. His reputation? Built on the opinions of others, which were always changeable. But his mind, his capacity to think, to question, to seek truth, that's still here. His ability to love wisdom, to pursue understanding, that's still here. The deepest part of what he is, the part that chose philosophy over easy answers, that chose justice even when it was dangerous, that's still here. He picks up the quill again, energized now by this recognition. I begin to see that what I thought was loss might be clarification, like when a sculptor chips away marble to reveal the statue that was always waiting inside. The analogy pleases him. Yes, that's what this feels like. Not destruction, but revelation. The removal of everything that wasn't essential, leaving behind what? What's left when you strip away all the external measures of success? True happiness, he writes slowly, thinking through each word, cannot depend on things that can be taken away. If it did, it would not be true happiness at all, but merely temporary pleasure, a brief respite between losses. This thought leads him deeper. He's seen so many people, himself included, chase after things that promised satisfaction but delivered only the need for more. More wealth, more influence, more recognition. Always more, because what they already had never felt like enough. The man who depends on external goods for his happiness is like someone building a house on sand. Not because the sand might shift, but because it will shift. The only question is when. The metaphor resonates through the stone walls of his cell. How many of the people he knew in Rome were building on sand? How many were confusing the accumulation of things with the cultivation of character? And yet, he doesn't write this with bitterness. Somehow, through the act of putting these thoughts into words, he feels a kind of compassion for his former self. The man who thought security could be found in position and wealth wasn't evil or foolish. He was just mistaken, looking for something real in places where it couldn't be found. Perhaps, he writes, true security lies not in accumulating things that cannot be lost, but in becoming the kind of person who can lose everything and still remain whole. The ink flows more smoothly now, as if the quill has found its proper rhythm. He thinks of the great philosophers he's studied. Socrates drinking hemlock, Cato choosing death over compromise, Seneca facing Nero's executioners. None of them could be broken by external circumstances because their sense of themselves came from something deeper. What would it mean to be unbreakable? Not because nothing could touch me, but because what touches me could not touch what truly matters. He pauses here, aware that he's approaching something important, something that might change how he understands not just his current situation, but everything that led to it. The mysterious presence he sensed in the darkness seems closer now, not as a separate entity, but as something emerging from within his own process of questioning, as if wisdom itself were awakening through the simple act of honest inquiry. I see now that I have been asking the wrong questions. Not, why did this happen to me? But, What does this reveal about what actually matters? Not, how can I get back what I've lost? But, what remains that was always truly mine? The shift in questioning feels like stepping from a small room into a vast cathedral. The same person, but suddenly aware of dimensions that were always there, waiting to be noticed. He sets down the quill and flexes his fingers. They're stained with ink now, marked by this new kind of work. Not the work of administration or politics, but the work of understanding, the work of becoming. Outside his window, he can hear the sounds of Rome waking up. Merchants calling their wares, cartwheels on stone, the distant murmur of the Forum coming to life. The world he once moved through with such confidence, now continuing without him. But instead of loss, he feels something approaching gratitude. Not for his circumstances, but for what his circumstances are revealing, like a fever that burns away illness, leaving the body stronger than before. Perhaps, he writes in closing, this cell is not my prison, but my laboratory, the place where I finally learn to distinguish between what I am and what I merely possessed. The quill rests against the parchment, and Boethius sits back in his simple chair. The morning is fully here now, filling his cell with clear, honest light. And in that light, he begins to see the outline of something he never expected to find in this place. Not just hope, but a kind of joy. The joy of finally asking the right questions. Echoes of the library. The joy of finally asking the right questions. And as that joy settles into his bones, Boethius finds his mind turning toward something that has been both his greatest love and, perhaps, his greatest illusion. His library. You know this feeling, don't you? When you've built something magnificent, when you've assembled the tools and resources and knowledge that should have made everything work perfectly, when you had it all mapped out, systematized, organized, and then somehow, despite all that preparation, despite all that wisdom at your fingertips, the world still found a way to surprise you. Boethius closes his eyes and lets himself remember. The vast library in his Roman villa, with its soaring ceilings and endless shelves, scrolls and codices arranged with meticulous care, the works of Plato and Aristotle, Cicero and Seneca, commentaries upon commentaries, translations he had labored over himself, Greek philosophy rendered into Latin, bridges built between worlds of thought. He had been so proud of that collection, not just for its size, though it was impressive by any measure, but for what it represented, the accumulation of human wisdom across centuries, the best thoughts of the best minds, all gathered under one roof, all available to him whenever he needed guidance. And yet, here he sits, in a cell with no books at all, and somehow he feels closer to real wisdom than he ever did surrounded by all those carefully catalogued volumes. It's a strange realization. Not bitter, exactly. More like recognition. In your own work, in what you're building, you've likely felt this tension, the gap between knowing and understanding, between having access to information and actually grasping truth. You can read every business book, study every case study, analyze every market trend, and still find yourself lying awake at 3 a.m, uncertain about the path forward. Because wisdom, real wisdom, isn't something you can simply collect and store. Boethius lets his memory wander through those familiar corridors. He sees himself as he was just months ago, moving between the shelves with the confidence of someone who believed that every question had an answer, and every answer could be found in the right text. When the political situation grew complex, he consulted Plato's Republic. When facing moral dilemmas, he turned to Aristotle's Ethics. When needing strength, he read the Stoics. And all of that reading, all of that study, it had given him knowledge, certainly. It had made him formidable in debate, respected in the court, sought after as a translator and commentator. But had it given him wisdom? He thinks of Plato's famous allegory, the one about the cave. Prisoners chained in darkness, watching shadows on the wall, mistaking those shadows for reality itself. Until one prisoner breaks free, climbs toward the light, and sees the world as it actually is. Perhaps his library had been its own kind of cave. Beautiful, comfortable, filled with the shadows of other people's insights. And perhaps this cell, stark and simple as it is, has become his climb toward the light. The thought doesn't diminish his love for those books, for those brilliant minds who came before him. If anything, he feels more connected to them now than ever. Because now he understands something that no amount of reading could have taught him. He understands what it means to lose everything and discover that you haven't lost everything. To have your foundations shaken and find that the real foundation was always something else entirely. This is what Socrates knew when he said he knew nothing. What Marcus Aurelius understood when he wrote his private notes to himself, not as a philosopher addressing the world, but as a human being trying to make sense of his own experience. What Epictetus grasped when he taught that we cannot control what happens to us, only how we respond. They weren't just sharing ideas. They were sharing the fruit of their own wrestling with uncertainty, their own encounters with the limits of human control. And now, Boethius sits in that same tradition, not as a scholar studying their words, but as a fellow traveler on the same difficult path. The morning light shifts slightly in his cell, and for a moment, for just a moment, he could swear he's not alone. It's subtle at first, just a sense of presence, the way you might feel when someone enters a room behind you, even before you turn to look. The quality of the silence changes. The very air seems to hold its breath. Boethius opens his eyes slowly, almost afraid to break whatever spell is settling over this small space. And there, in the corner where the light falls most gently, he sees, or thinks he sees, the outline of a figure. She is both ancient and timeless, both familiar and utterly mysterious. Her robes seem to shimmer between different lengths, sometimes reaching only to her knees, sometimes sweeping the floor, as if she exists in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Her eyes hold the depth of centuries, but her expression is gentle, almost amused. Lady Philosophy. Not as he had imagined her during all those years of study, not as an abstract concept or intellectual construct, but as a living presence, as real as the stone walls around him, as immediate as his own heartbeat. She doesn't speak immediately. Instead, she looks at him with something that might be fondness, the way a teacher looks at a student who has finally grasped a lesson that seemed impossibly difficult just moments before. And Boethius understands, without words, what she sees when she looks at him. Not the fallen consul, not the disgraced senator, not even the condemned prisoner. She sees someone who has finally stopped trying to possess wisdom and has begun, instead, to let wisdom possess him. "You built a beautiful library," she says finally, and her voice carries the music of spheres, the harmony that underlies all true knowledge. "But you were never meant to live in it." He nods, surprised by how little surprise he feels at her presence. Of course she would come. Of course she would find him here, in this place where he has finally stopped trying to summon her and has simply waited. I thought, he says slowly, that if I gathered enough of their words, enough of their insights, I would somehow possess what they possessed. And what did they possess? The question hangs in the air between them, and Boethius realizes he has been preparing to answer it his entire life. Not certainty, he says finally, not security, not even happiness, exactly. They possessed the courage to keep asking questions, even when the answers led somewhere difficult. Lady Philosophy smiles, and the light in the cell seems to grow warmer. Your library was never meant to give you answers, she continues. It was meant to teach you how to ask better questions. And now, finally, you are asking the right ones. Boethius thinks of all those volumes, all those carefully preserved thoughts. He had approached them like a merchant, trying to extract value, to take something away. But perhaps that was never the point. Perhaps the point was to join the conversation, to add his own voice to the great ongoing dialogue between human beings and the mystery of existence. The weight you carry, Lady Philosophy says, and somehow she is speaking not just to Boethius, but to you, there in your own darkness, wrestling with your own questions. It was never meant to be carried alone. And what you're building, it's not separate from this ancient conversation. It's part of it. Every leader who has ever lain awake wondering if they're making the right choices, every person who has ever felt the crushing responsibility of other people's livelihoods, other people's trust, every soul who has discovered that success brings its own kind of loneliness, all of them are part of this same eternal dialogue. The questions don't get easier, but you get better at living with them. Boethius looks at Lady Philosophy, and then at his simple cell, and then at the parchment where his own words are slowly taking shape. His library is gone, but the conversation continues. The books have been taken away, but the wisdom they pointed toward, that was never contained in the books themselves. It was always here, in this moment, in this encounter between a human soul and the mystery that surrounds us all. So what now? He asks, and Lady Philosophy's answer comes not in words, but in the growing certainty that the conversation itself is the answer. The willingness to keep engaging with the deepest questions, even when, especially when, everything else has been stripped away. The real library was never made of books at all. The turning wheel of fortune. As Boethius sits in the growing light of that Roman dawn, something shifts in the quality of his attention. The conversation with Lady Philosophy has opened a door. But to what, exactly? He finds himself thinking about a wheel. Not the wheels of the carts that clatter past his window, carrying goods to market. Not the potter's wheel, or the mill wheel, or any of the countless wheels that turn the machinery of daily life in this ancient city. No. This is the wheel that every Roman knows, that every person who has ever held power or lost it understands with a kind of visceral certainty. Fortuna's wheel. The great turning wheel of fate that lifts us up and casts us down with the same indifferent motion. The wheel that had carried him from obscurity to the heights of Roman society, and then deposited him here, in this cell, awaiting execution. Lady Philosophy seems to sense his thoughts. Her presence grows more distinct, more real, as if his willingness to engage with these deeper questions has somehow strengthened her ability to reach him. "Tell me about this wheel," she says, and her voice carries the patience of someone who has had this conversation countless times before, with countless souls who found themselves broken on fortune's turning. Boethius closes his eyes. He can almost see it. This great cosmic wheel, turning slowly but inexorably against the stars, and clinging to its rim, like insects, the ambitious and the powerful, the wealthy and the famous, all of them rising and falling according to laws they cannot comprehend or control. "I thought I understood it," he says quietly. "When I was rising, when everything was going well, I thought the wheel was something that happened to other people, to those who weren't careful enough, weren't smart enough, weren't worthy enough." The admission tastes bitter in his mouth. How naive he had been. How absolutely convinced of his own specialness. "I built my life as if I could somehow step off the wheel," he continues, "as if virtue and intelligence and good intentions were enough to exempt me from this." He gestures at the stone walls, at his circumstances, at the weight of everything that has collapsed around him. Lady Philosophy nods, and there is no judgment in her expression. Only understanding. "And what do you see now?" she asks. Boethius opens his eyes and looks out through the small window at the city beyond. Rome continues its ancient rhythms, indifferent to his fate. People are waking up, beginning their day, making their plans, pursuing their ambitions. Many of them probably riding high on fortune's wheel, convinced of their own permanence, just as he had been. "I see that the wheel never stops turning," he says. "I see that thinking I could step off it was the height of arrogance." But even as he says this, something else begins to emerge. A different way of seeing the whole situation. Although, he pauses, feeling his way toward a thought that seems almost too radical to voice. Although maybe the real question isn't how to get off the wheel. Lady Philosophy waits. The morning light continues to strengthen, and somewhere in the distance, Boethius can hear the sound of children playing. Life persisting, life continuing, even in the shadow of empire and execution. Maybe the real question, he continues slowly, is how to find peace while riding it. And there it is. The insight that will reshape everything he thinks he knows about happiness, about security, about what it means to build a life worth living. The wheel will turn. This is not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be accepted. Fortune will rise and fall. Empires will flourish and crumble. Careers will soar and crash. The people he once knew are probably already forgetting his name, already adjusting to the new political reality, already finding ways to distance themselves from his disgrace. This is not a betrayal. This is simply the wheel, turning as it always has, as it always will. But if the wheel never stops, he asks Lady Philosophy, if everything we build is ultimately temporary, what's the point? Why try to build anything at all? It's the question that keeps so many awake at 3 a.m., staring at the ceiling. The question that whispers in the quiet moments between meetings, between phone calls, between the endless demands of building something meaningful in an uncertain world. If it can all disappear tomorrow, if the market can turn, if the funding can dry up, if the team can scatter, if everything you've worked for can vanish as quickly as it appeared, why pour your life into it? Lady Philosophy's smile is gentle but knowing. "Tell me," she says, "when you were building, when you were creating, when you were fully engaged in the work that mattered to you, were you thinking about the wheel?" Boethius considers this. He remembers the late nights in his study, wrestling with translations, trying to bridge the gap between Greek wisdom and Roman practicality. He remembers the satisfaction of a well-crafted argument, the joy of discovering a new connection between ideas, the deep pleasure of work that felt aligned with his deepest values. In those moments, no, he wasn't thinking about fortune or fate or the precariousness of his position. He was simply present, fully engaged, lost in the work itself. The wheel turns, Lady Philosophy continues, but the quality of our engagement doesn't depend on where we happen to be on the wheel at any given moment. Outside his window, a merchant calls out his wares. A dog barks. A cart rumbles over cobblestones. The ordinary symphony of human life continues, indifferent to philosophical revelations and imperial politics alike. And somehow, this ordinariness is comforting, reassuring even. You mean, Boethius says slowly, that the work, the building, the creating, has value independent of its outcomes? I mean, Lady Philosophy replies, that you are not your circumstances. You are not your position on the wheel. You are the one who chooses how to respond to wherever the wheel happens to carry you. The insight hits him like a physical sensation, a loosening in his chest, a release of tension he didn't even know he was carrying. All this time, he had been identifying himself with his position. Boethius, the consul. Boethius, the philosopher. Boethius, the powerful, the influential, the respected. But those were just locations on the wheel, temporary positions in an ever-changing game. The real Boethius, the part that could think and choose and respond and create, that part was never dependent on fortune at all. So, when everything falls apart, he says, testing this new understanding, when the wheel turns and everything I've built crumbles, I'm still here. The part of me that can think and choose and respond, that's still intact. More than intact, Lady Philosophy says. Often, it's only when everything else is stripped away that we discover how much we actually have, how much we've always had. Boethius thinks about this, about the strange peace he's been finding in this cell, about the clarity that has emerged from loss, about the conversation he's having right now, which feels more real and more valuable than most of the conversations he had when he was powerful and connected and surrounded by people eager to please him. The wheel turns, he says, but the center is still. Lady Philosophy nods. And where do you choose to locate yourself? On the rim, where every turn brings drama and crisis? Or at the center, where you can watch the turning with, what would you call it? Boethius searches for the word. Not indifference. That's too cold, too disconnected. Not resignation. That suggests defeat. Equanimity, he says finally. With equanimity. The word feels right in his mouth. Balanced, steady. Not the absence of caring, but caring from a place of inner stability that doesn't depend on external circumstances. He can build with equanimity. He can create with equanimity. He can engage fully with the work that matters to him while simultaneously holding lightly to the outcomes. The wheel will turn. This is not a threat, but simply the nature of things. And he can choose to build from the center, to create from a place of inner stillness that remains constant, regardless of where fortune happens to carry him. The realization brings with it a kind of joy that surprises him, not the giddy excitement of success or the desperate relief of avoiding failure, but something deeper, more sustainable. The joy of knowing that the most important things, the capacity to think and choose and love and create, are not subject to fortune's wheel at all. They are his. They have always been his. And no emperor, no political upheaval, no turn of fate can take them away. The wheel turns, but the center holds. Inner peace, enduring wisdom. The wheel turns, but the center holds. And in that holding, in that perfect stillness at the heart of all motion. Boethius finds something he had never expected to discover in this cold stone cell: peace. Not the fragile peace of favorable circumstances, not the temporary quiet between storms, but something deeper, something that seems to rise from the very foundations of existence itself. He leans back against the wall, feeling the ancient stone against his shoulders, stone that has witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the birth and death of countless dreams, the same stone that will remain long after his own story has ended, long after the weight he carries has been set down forever. There is comfort in this, in being part of something so much larger than his own concerns. The small window high in his cell has grown dark again, another day passing into night. But tonight, the darkness feels different, not oppressive, not heavy with worry and regret, but gentle, welcoming. Through that narrow opening, he can see stars beginning to appear, tiny points of light scattered across the vast expanse of heaven. "Look up," Lady Philosophy whispers, though her voice now seems to come not from beside him, but from within, from that quiet center where the wheel cannot reach. "Look up and remember how small your troubles are, how brief your sufferings, how temporary even your greatest achievements." And he does look up, craning his neck to see through that small window to the infinite sky beyond. The stars are the same stars that shone on Rome in its glory, the same lights that watched over his childhood, his education, his rise to power, the same celestial fires that will burn long after every earthly kingdom has crumbled to dust. In their presence, he feels his perspective shifting, expanding, like a man who has been studying a single page too closely and suddenly holds the book at arm's length to see the whole: his disgrace, his imprisonment, his approaching death. They are real, yes. They matter. But they are also temporary, brief notes in a symphony too vast for any single mind to comprehend. "The universe is not cruel," he whispers to the darkness. "It simply is, and I am part of it, not the center of it, not the victim of it, just part of it." The realization brings with it a strange lightness, as if some burden he had been carrying without even knowing it has suddenly been lifted from his shoulders. All his life, he had been trying to control things, to shape outcomes, to build something that would last. And there had been nothing wrong with that building, nothing wrong with the effort, nothing wrong with caring deeply about the work. But he had made the mistake of thinking that his peace depended on the success of those efforts, that his worth was measured by the permanence of what he created. That happiness could only come from favorable results. Now, in this cell, with everything stripped away, he sees the error. The building matters, but not because of what it achieves. It matters because of what it reveals, what it calls forth, what it allows to flow through him into the world. The same creative force that scattered stars across the heavens, the same intelligence that shapes the turning of seasons and the growth of trees, flows through every human effort to build something good and true and beautiful. When he wrote his books, when he served in government, when he tried to bridge the gap between Roman and Gothic cultures, he was not separate from that cosmic creativity. He was participating in it, adding his voice to the eternal conversation, contributing his small part to the vast, ongoing work of existence itself. And that participation, that flowing, that creative response to life, cannot be taken away by any emperor or any turn of fortune. It is what he is. not what he has. I understand now, he breathes, and his words seem to dissolve into the darkness like incense rising. I understand what you've been trying to teach me. The peace deepens, settling into his bones like warmth from a fire, spreading through his chest like the slow rhythm of deep breathing. He thinks of his wife, his children, his friends, all the people he loves who are somewhere out there under these same stars. The separation from them is real. The pain of that separation is real. But the love itself, that remains untouched, undiminished. Distance cannot reduce it. Time cannot erode it. Even death cannot destroy it. Love, like wisdom, like the capacity for joy, exists in that still center where the wheel cannot reach. He thinks of his enemies too, the men who betrayed him, who twisted his words, who condemned him to this fate. And surprisingly, he finds that the anger has faded, not into indifference, but into something closer to understanding. They too are caught on fortune's wheel, driven by fears he recognizes, seeking securities he once sought himself. They too carry weight they cannot set down, build things they hope will last, struggle against the fundamental uncertainty that touches every human life. In their very cruelty, they reveal their own suffering, their own desperate need for the peace he is only now beginning to find. Forgiveness, he whispers, and the word seems to echo off the stone walls like a prayer. Not forgiveness that excuses or forgets, but forgiveness that sees clearly, that understands the universal human condition, that recognizes the fear beneath the anger, the pain beneath the power. The stars wheel slowly overhead, following their ancient paths, marking time on a scale that makes human urgency seem almost quaint. Somewhere out there, other leaders are lying awake tonight, staring at ceilings in palaces and counting houses, carrying their own invisible weight, wrestling with their own impossible choices, building their own fragile monuments against the darkness. And he feels connected to them, all of them, across centuries and cultures and circumstances. The weight is different. The building takes different forms, but the fundamental human experience, the search for meaning, for security, for something that will last, that remains constant. They are all part of the same vast conversation, all contributing verses to the same infinite poem, all learning the same essential lessons about what can be controlled and what must be accepted, what can be built and what must be received, what can be grasped and what can only be allowed. His breathing has grown slow and deep, matching some rhythm deeper than thought, older than worry, more fundamental than fear, in and out, like waves on an eternal shore, like the turning of seasons, like the patient circulation of stars. The cell around him has not changed. The stone is still cold, the space still narrow, his fate still sealed. But somehow, none of that matters now, not because it isn't real, but because it isn't final. This moment, this breath, this capacity to think and feel and understand. This is what's real. This is what's his. This is what no power on earth can touch. Lady Philosophy sits beside him now, in comfortable silence. No longer a separate presence, but simply the deepest part of himself, the part that has always known these truths, the part that was waiting patiently for his mind to grow quiet enough to listen. "Thank you," he whispers, though he's not sure if he's speaking to her, or to the darkness, or to existence itself. The gratitude is real. profound, not for his circumstances, but for this, this understanding, this peace, this strange, unexpected joy that has bloomed in the most unlikely soil. Tomorrow will bring what it brings. But tonight he rests in the center of the wheel, in the still point around which all motion turns, in the quiet heart of the storm, where the most important things, the things that truly matter, the things that make us human, remain forever safe. The stars continue their ancient dance overhead, the same stars that will shine on other seekers in other cells, other builders carrying other weights, other hearts learning to find peace not in the success of their efforts, but in the purity of their participation, not in the permanence of what they create, but in the love with which they create it, not in the favor of fortune, but in the inexhaustible capacity to think and choose and hope and begin again, that lies at the very center of what it means to be human, where the wheel turns, but the center holds, and the deepest truths wait patiently to be discovered by anyone willing to set down their burden long enough to listen to the silence between heartbeats, the space between thoughts, the eternal pause where all true building begins and all real peace is found.